So those are some suggestions of how you might want to curate the evidence. We've looked at the UKPSF. I now want to just quickly outline the 4 categories of fellowship. It's very important that we distinguish these as categories and not levels. Sometimes you read people will just talk about levels, different levels of fellowship. The danger of thinking about them as levels is that you think about them as being very much a progression, that you start as an associate and after 3 or 4 years you should be able to become a fellow, and after 2 or 3 years a lot more you should be able to become a senior, and after you've been in practice for 10, 12 years you should become a principal. And failing to do that is somehow a lack of personal professional progress. I think that's a very negative way to look at it, and certainly the descriptors certainly don't support that. So I'm going to try and persuade you that we should be thinking about this as categories. Now clearly the danger is, of course, is that a lot of promotion schemes within universities are now linking UKPSF with particular levels of promotion. So to become a senior lecturer you have to be a senior fellow, and I think that's potentially quite disruptive in the sector. I think arguably they're misnamed. I'm going to come on to that in just a second. Each category of fellowship has an indicative profile, a suggestion of the kind of people that might fit into that category. And then there's a descriptor. I'm going to go through those a bit later. I won't go into quite as much detail because you've got them in front of you, but it's I think it is worth just highlighting them. The way I present these categories of fellowship is I tend to rename them because I think it makes it much clearer. Now, this is a personal view. I'm not aware of other people doing this. Certainly it's not official advanced HEA policy and practice, but I think it provides an enormous amount of clarity. So if you think of associate fellowships as being teaching fellowships, and really they're providing, you have to evidence your teaching and learning support. So pretty much everybody in practice can do that. Right? So anyone, even if you're only doing 3 or 4 guest lectures in the year, the chances are you would be able to make associate fellowship. Fellowship is more a broader academic role. So academic fellowship was likely to involve designing learning, designing, possibly inputting into modules, possibly module leadership, possibly certainly supervising students and so on. So I think about academic fellowship as being a broader academic practice. I distinguish that from teaching and learning support to being academic practice. So we can find colleagues in our library services, in our IT services, our student support services, who can become associate fellows, who simply by virtue of the role that they play, nothing to do with their level of experience, they may be brilliant at what they do and they may have done it for 20 years, but they will not be able to evidence fellowship because they're not in an academic role. So that's why categories rather than levels. Senior fellowship is then kind of a leadership fellowship. So we're all about academic leadership. It's about really supporting your colleagues. Now, it doesn't have to be colleagues in your discipline. It could be. You might be eligible for academic leadership fellowship at a senior level, for senior fellowship, because you are a leading light in teaching your discipline in your institution. But the chances are you might equally be working across disciplines or across faculties in some thematic way. As I mentioned, internationalization or educational technology or some other thematic way. And then principal fellowships should be thought of as strategic fellowships. So they really are about taking a strategic role in learning and teaching. Now, very often that's institutionally. It can be within a faculty, although it has to be a very broad role, and I think arguably for any recognition that I might be asked to review, I would expect then there to be a very significant amount of external input coming into that faculty effort. It might be across institutions, again it might be much more thematic, but it has to be very much a strategic role rather than operational leadership. So I think those 4 categories of fellowship, rather than thinking about them as levels, thinking about them as teaching fellowships, academic fellowships, leadership fellowship, and strategic fellowships, I think is very helpful. The profiles of these 4 categories, I think, do support my description of them. So you say some ability, so individuals able to provide evidence of effectiveness in relation to their professional roles, with which typically will include at least some teaching and learning support responsibilities. So it's very important that it's a relatively low bar, to be honest. Most people working in any learning and teaching support role within universities should be able to provide evidence against the UKPSF, certainly at associate level. So this is descriptor 1, so you'll see the literature often refers to D1, so this is D1 Associate Fellowship. Fellowship is, again, as I say, more about academic fellowship, and here we're looking at people who can provide evidence of broadly based effectiveness in a more substantive teaching and supportive learning role. Now it's a little bit broad in terms of how it's worded, but I think arguably people who are tutoring individual students have some personal responsibility for individual students, who are designing assessment, marking assessment, who have a full range of academic roles as it relates to learning and teaching. They will be able to generate evidence. Senior fellowship is really around supporting colleagues in their academic development, their academic progress. And so you need to provide evidence of sustained record of effectiveness in relation to teaching and learning. So it's, as I say, it's very unlikely, even if you are appointed straight in as a senior lecturer to a role, you're not likely to get senior fellowship, because you need to provide a record of sustained effectiveness, effective engagement with learning and teaching. Now, what constitutes sustained depends a little bit on your context. Some institutions do mandate it has to be 3 years in role or 5 years in role. I'm a little bit more flexible in that, but I think it depends a little bit on someone's previous roles. If someone has come from a vocational background at a senior level and has done a lot of adult learning in a vocational setting and then comes into higher education, then I would argue that's a sustained engagement, regardless of the context in which they work. Someone who, on the other hand, who might have done 5 years as a technical trainer in an IT context is unlikely, in my mind, to be able to provide evidence of a sustained engagement across the UKPSF. So it's about being able to provide some historical evidence for your engagement. So it's much better to think about it as something you start now and you do over the next 3 years, rather than something that you sort of assume that you have experience to do. And again, it's about organisational leadership, management, specific aspects of teaching and learning. It's really about leading others, either discipline-wise or thematically. And then strategic fellowship, again, you can see the descriptor here. This is D4 now, so D1, D2, D3, D4. We've got highly experienced academics able to provide evidence of a sustained and effective record of impact on the strategic level, at a strategic level, in relation to teaching and learning. And I think what really very often gets people caught out when they put their portfolio together to become a principal is that they just don't have evidence of an impact that they can evidence. They've done a lot of stuff. They might have written a couple of strategies. They may have been an external examiner for a whole program somewhere else. To my mind, that doesn't necessarily mean much. That might just be part of your role. Your institution may in fact insist that you become an external somewhere, so you're doing it because you have to. You may have zero impact. And so it's very important that you have evidence of strategic impact in relation to learning and teaching.